Chapter 1, my name is Emily Carter, and the day I opened a cream envelope from my own mother was the day my world cracked open. Inside was a summons with accusations that cut deeper than ink. My brother Michael stood beside her name, ready to drag me into court and strip me of everything. I had spent my career defending clients from betrayals like this, but I never imagined the plaintiffs would be my own blood. What I did not know then was that my father had left behind a secret letter hidden with his lawyer. A letter that would later silence an entire courtroom when it called me his star client. The envelope sat in front of me like a brick, small enough to hold in my hand, but heavy enough to make my stomach turn. I had handled hundreds of these in my career summons and complaints, the familiar format of litigation. I thought I knew the weight of paper and ink. I had no idea how different it would feel when my own name... I lifted the first page again, eyes tracing each line, forcing myself to read slowly. My clients had always told me the words blurred when fear took over. I never really believed them until now. It was as if the letters swam before me, and I had to drag them into focus. Wrongful possession of inherited assets. Defendant. I repeated the words under my breath, my voice trembling in the stillness of the room. The plaintiffs. Margaret Carter. My mother, 60 years old, who had spent decades orchestrating charity galas and Sunday dinners, who insisted on family photos every Christmas, even when we were barely speaking. And Michael Carter, my brother, 4 years older, the golden son who had inherited not only my father's business, but his approval. Their names sat cold on the page, the ink unfeeling, but the betrayal burned hot in my chest. I dropped the paper onto the table and stood pacing toward the window. Cars lined up at the light, brake lights was glowing against the late afternoon haze. A couple hurried down the sidewalk with grocery bags, laughing. Life was moving ordinary and uninterrupted. Inside my apartment, time had fractured. I pressed my forehead to the glass, the cool surface grounding me for a moment. Then I turned back to the table, to the envelope that had already changed everything. My hands curled at my sides. I wanted to pick it up and rip it apart, to shred it into confetti that would scatter across the floor. But no matter how many pieces I tore it into, the lawsuit would remain. The court date would still be set. My family would still be prepared to stand across from me and call me a thief. The sound of my own breathing filled the room, uneven and shallow. I forced a deep inhale, then another. I remembered telling clients to do the same. Remembered the way some of them clung to my words, as if I were the only there was no one to anchor me but myself. World. The papers lay open where I had dropped them. I sat down again, dragging the chair closer, and read through the details. Michael claimed I had mismanaged the Carter Foundation Trust, using funds for personal gain. I laughed out loud, the sound brittle and humorless. I had poured hours into that trust, overseeing scholarships, reviewing proposals, ensuring the grants went exactly where my father had intended. To see those efforts twisted into accusations, cut deeper than I could have imagined. I flipped to the signature page. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable, looping elegant, the same she used on birthday cards and grocery lists, taped to the fridge when I was a child. Seeing it there beneath a legal motion felt like a wound I didn't know how to close. I pressed my thumb against the ink, half expecting it to smear, to prove itself unreal. A memory flashed unbidden of my father's funeral 3 years earlier. My mother's arm looped tightly around Michael's, as if she would fall without his support. She had glanced at me only once, her eyes glassy, distant. I had told myself it was grief. Now I wondered if it had always been choice. The kettle on the stove whistled softly, reminding me I had set water to boil before the mail arrived. I shut it off, pouring the water into a mug I didn't really want, just for something to do with my hands. The steam curled upward, fragrant with chamomile, but even the warmth against my palms couldn't cut through the chill inside me. I sat again, forcing myself to read every word until I could no longer deny it. Page after page, accusation after accusation, all written in the cold, sterile language of the law. It was my native tongue, the world I navigated with skill and precision. But now it was weaponized against me. A summons to appear, my name beneath it. The final line sealed it. The expectation of my response within 20 days. 20 days to prepare for a battle I had never wanted, but could not escape. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. A small crack ran across the plaster above me. A detail I had never noticed before. It felt symbolic. A fracture spreading silently until one day it could no longer be ignored. My phone buzzed on the table, startling me. I grabbed it quickly, irrationally, hoping to see Michael's name, to hear him say this had gone too far, that he would fix it. Instead, it was a reminder for a client meeting the next morning. I closed the notification without reading further. The apartment was too quiet again. I imagined the echo of footsteps in my father's old office, the way he used to pace when deep in thought. I wondered what he would have said if he had lived to see this day. Would he have stepped in, or had he always still lay for me to fight this battle alone? I gathered them into a neat stack, tapping the edges against the table until they aligned. My fingers brushed once more over the word defendant. A tear slipped free, tracing a line down my cheek, but I did not wipe it away. I whispered into the empty room, not for anyone else to hear, but for myself. I am not a thief. The words steadied me more than I expected. I sat up straighter, shoulders back, palms flat against the table. The betrayal still burned, but beneath it, a spark of resolve flickered. They had chosen this path, and I would answer. For now, I let the silence settle again. The envelope lay beside me, the seal broken, the future wide open and uncertain. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, until the weight in my chest eased just enough to let me breathe. The night outside deepened, city lights glowing against the dark, and I knew this was only the beginning. But I also knew I would not be erased Emily by Carter, a single word, and whatever storm was coming, I would face it head on. Chapter 2. I remember the weight of that day in July of 2020. As if the air itself had been pressing against my chest. The funeral was barely over, the scent of lilies and damp earth still clinging to my black dress when we gathered in the paneled conference room at Whitaker and Feldman downtown. The blinds were half drawn against the afternoon sun, slivers of light cutting across the polished mahogany table. My father's absence felt like a shadow, stretching over us all, heavy and inescapable. Charles Whitaker, tall and composed in his gray suit, cleared his throat as he organized the papers in front of him. His voice had always carried authority, even when he spoke in a whisper, and that day it seemed to echo against the walls. He read through the standard language, first listing debts, settled small charitable bequests, routine details that blurred into the far end of the table, fingers twisting the edge of my program from the funeral, trying to anchor myself. Michael sat opposite me, relaxed in a way that felt almost arrogant, his shoulders back, his chin lifted as if he already knew what was coming. My mother sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve, her pearls catching the light with every small movement. She had not looked at me since we walked into the building. When Charles shifted his eyes toward Michael, I felt the inevitable before the words came. To my son, Michael Carter, I leave full control and ownership of Carter Hardware Supply, as well as the family residence in Brookline and all associated properties. My brother's smile flickered for just a second, contained but satisfied. My mother's fingers tightened against his arm, her lips curving ever so slightly. I sat frozen, the company, listening as if from underwater, the tangible pieces of my father's empire all placed into Michael's hands. I tried to swallow, but my throat closed. For a moment, I wondered if I would even be mentioned. Charles turned another page. To my daughter, Emily Grace Carter. I leave management rights and sole discretion over the Carter Foundation Trust. He paused, not for effect, but enough for the words to strike me like a sudden gust of wind. The silence that followed was louder than any sound could have been. I blinked, certain I had misheard. The Carter Foundation Trust. I had known of its existence in passing, whispered about at family dinners, but it had never been discussed in detail. My father kept it quiet. A fund he had nurtured privately for years, intended for investments and philanthropy. Charles explained calmly. His voice measured that the trust carried influence beyond its size, designed to shape long-term projects and opportunities. My father had never spoken to me directly in my ears, never hinted that I would hold the keys to something so powerful. I nodded stiffly, trying to hide the tremor in my hands. Michael's brows knitted together, his smirk faltering. My mother's face was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp, fixed on me like daggers. As the reading continued, I felt their gaze heavy on my skin. Every sentence Charles spoke after that seemed irrelevant. I could not stop hearing the words. Sole discretion, full management, me, not Michael. Me, the daughter who had always been told she was too soft, too detached from the family business to matter. The session ended with the scrape of chairs against the floor. I gathered my bags slowly, my mind racing. Michael moved first, catching me in the hallway before I reached the elevator. His steps were deliberate, his expression calm, but his voice low and sharp enough to cut. That is not yours to keep, Emily. Searching his face for some hint of brotherly affection. Some lingering connection after all we had shared growing up under the same roof. But there was nothing there. Only warning, only promise. My mother stood a step behind him, silent, her eyes cold as stone. She said nothing, offered no word of comfort or even civility. She simply looked at me, then at the elevator doors, as if waiting for me to leave. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to speak to defend myself, but the words died in my throat. The elevator bell chimed and the door slid open. I stepped inside, gripping the strap of my bag so tightly my knuckles ached. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of them together, my mother's hand steady on Michael's arm, their figures framed in the fluorescent light of the hallway. My pulse raced with a mix of fear and defiance. I had been underestimated before. I had been dismissed before, quietly declared in whispers and stares. I rode down in silence, the soft hum of the elevator masking the roar in my head. When the doors opened onto the lobby, the cool air of the marble hall rushed against my skin. I walked out into the bright summer sunlight, blinking the world moving briskly around me. Even then, with grief fresh and my father's absence raw, I understood something had shifted irreversibly. Michael had claimed the company, my mother had chosen her side, and I had been handed a responsibility that was equal parts gift and burden. That night, I sat alone at my apartment in Cambridge, the trust documents spread across the table pages, filled with numbers and clauses that would shape my future. I ran my fingers over the lines, searching for some trace of my father's voice between the legal jargon. What had he seen in me that he had not seen in Michael? Why the memory of Michael's words been echoed long after midnight? That is not yours to keep. His warning had not been idle. It had been a vow. The next morning, I woke with the same words circling in my mind, my coffee growing cold as I stared out the window at the Charles River. The trust was mine now, but already it felt like a target painted across my back. It would be months before the lawsuit arrived, but even then, deep down, I knew this moment was only the beginning of something much larger. A storm building on the horizon that none of us could avoid. The first sign came on a gray morning in March, when my phone lit up with the number of my bank. I had just poured coffee and sat at the kitchen table, still trying to gather myself after a restless night. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, and completely detached. Ms. Carter, I am calling to inform you that several of your accounts have been frozen pending a legal matter. My grip on the mug tightened until I thought it might crack. What legal matter? I asked, though part of me already knew. The representative hesitated before continuing. According to court records, a temporary order was issued. We are required to freeze any accounts associated with the Carter Foundation Trust until the dispute is resolved. For a moment, I could not speak. The line buzzed faintly in my ear, the hum of distance. My accounts were my safety woman on the other end, the lifeline that kept the projects running. The scholarships paid the community center. Construction on schedule. Without access to those funds, everything I had worked for would stall. I forced my voice steady enough to ask when the freeze would be lifted. She told me it depended on the court and that she could not give me a timeline. I ended the call before my voice cracked, setting the phone down as if it had burned me. The apartment felt smaller than ever. I walked to the window overlooking the street, watching people hurry past with umbrellas, faces hidden from the drizzle. They moved through their day unaware that mine had just been broken open. I pressed my palm flat against the glass, the chill seeping into my skin, and tried to think. My laptop sat waiting on the table. I opened it and logged into the trust portal. The numbers staring back at me, half of them grayed out, inaccessible. A notice flashed at the top. The words might as well have been a lock. Pending legal review. I clicked through the projects one by one. The Carter Scholarship Fund paused. The Community Center on Blue Hill Avenue pending. The Vocational Training Program in Dorchester pending. Each line cut deeper than the last. I picked up the phone again, calling the coordinator of the scholarship program. She answered brightly, unaware of what had happened. Emily, we are about to send out acceptance letters. The kids are so excited. I closed my eyes, swallowing hard. I told her there might be a short delay, that some paperwork had to be sorted out. My voice sounded calm, practiced like every time I had reassured a client. When I hung up, I let my head fall into my hands. The faces of the students came to me, some I had met personally, others only through applications. A girl from Roxbury who wanted to be the first in her family to go to college. A boy who had written about fixing cars in his uncle's garage. They were waiting for a chance, dreaming of becoming an engineer. And now they would be forced to wait longer, because my own family had decided to strangle me financially. I paced the apartment, the hardwood creaking under my steps. I knew Michael's strategy as clearly as if he had laid it out before me. Cut off the funds, make me look incapable of managing the trust, then argue in court that I should be removed. It was calculated, effective, and cruel. The day stretched long and heavy. I tried calling the bank again, speaking to another representative, but the answer was the same. Court order. Nothing could be done until the case was resolved. The words repeated in my mind like a gavel striking again and again. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low. I brewed another pot of coffee I did not need and sat back at the table staring at the spreadsheets glowing on the screen. Rows of names, amounts, promised, dates scheduled. Each one, my hands hovered above the keys, I had made wanting to send emails, explanations, apologies. But I knew what that would mean. Admitting to the students and the community leaders that the money I had promised was out of reach. The thought of their disappointment settled like a stone in my chest. I scrolled through the list of scholarship recipients again. Their essays had been full of hope, of determination, of stories about parents working double shifts, about dreams of medicine and teaching and building something better. They had trusted me. Now their futures were tangled in the mess of my family's feud. My phone buzzed with a message from Sandra Lopez, my colleague and friend. Saw the court filing today. Call me when you can. I stared at the words, grateful for her support, but too raw to respond. I needed to process the weight of what had just happened before I could let anyone else in. I closed the laptop, then opened it again, unable to leave it shut. I opened the folder, grayed out numbers, taunted disbursements pending, and scrolled through the names once more. My eyes blurred, and I realized tears had slipped down without my noticing. I wiped them away quickly, angry at myself for breaking. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the pressure of everything I had built slipping from my grasp. The trust had been more than money. It had been a promise, a chance to prove to myself and to the world that I was more than what my family thought of me. And now, with a single order, Michael and my mother had reached into my life and squeezed it tight. I opened the laptop again one last time and pulled up the master spreadsheet. The list of students filled the screen, names and numbers, dreams reduced to cells in a grid. My throat tightened as I scrolled down. I whispered their names softly, a litany of promises I had not yet kept. My fingers trembled above the keyboard. The realization, for the first time, I felt as if I had betrayed them. Chapter 4. The first hearing arrived faster than I was ready for, though I had marked the date on every calendar I owned. The morning air in Boston was sharp with late March wind, the kind that sliced across the common and seeped through coats, no matter how tightly they were buttoned. I walked toward the courthouse, with my briefcase gripped hard in my hand, my stomach coiled into knots. I had passed through these doors countless times in my career, escorting nervous clients and assuring them they would survive what awaited inside. That morning, I was the one carrying dread, with every step my name stamped on the docket for all to see. The building loomed above me, its pale stone walls streaked with rain from the night before. The columns seemed taller, heavier, more judgmental than I remembered. Inside the lobby buzzed with the familiar symphony of heels on marble and hushed conversations. I moved through it on clatter of security, but my chest tightened as I reached the courtroom door. This was no longer a place of work. It was the battlefield where my family would try to dismantle me. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the sight nearly took my breath. At the plaintiff's table sat Michael, immaculate in his charcoal suit, a smirk tugging at his mouth as if victory were already assured. Beside him sat my mother, Margaret, spine straight, pearls gleaming against her navy jacket, her expression unreadable, but her loyalty carved into stone by her placement at his side. And then in the middle, adjusting papers with careful precision, was Charles Whitaker, my father's lawyer, the man who had guided our family through wills, contracts, and negotiations for decades, the man who had read my father's final words aloud. My heart lurched. Of all the faces I expected to see, his was the one that struck deepest. His head bent over a folder, he did not look at me, sliding down the bridge of his nose as he whispered something to a younger associate. Calm, detached, utterly professional. To anyone else in the room, he was simply another attorney doing his job. To me, he was a shadow of my father sitting at the wrong table. I forced my legs to carry me forward. Sandra Lopez, my attorney, stood as I approached her. Warm eyes, steady even as mine faltered. She touched my arm lightly, grounding me. "We have this," she murmured. I nodded, though the roaring in my ears almost drowned her out. I sat straightening my files with hands that trembled slightly, despite my best efforts. The judge entered and the room rose. My knees felt locked, but I pushed myself to stand, staring straight ahead. When we sat again, the proceedings began with the practiced rhythm of litigation. Michael's counsel stood launching into accusations like bullets. They painted me as unqualified, reckless, giant chart was incapable of managing numbers in red ink screaming misuse. The words blurred for a moment, panic pressing at the edges of my vision. Then Charles spoke. His voice carried the same measured cadence I had heard so many times growing up. Steady and authoritative. "That is not accurate," he said, leaning forward, finger pointing neatly to 2 highlighted transfers. Both were authorized disbursements executed in compliance with the trust charter and approved by the board. His tone was factual, clipped, devoid of emotion. Yet it sliced through Michael's counsel like a scalpel. The courtroom shifted subtly. Michael's attorney stumbled, attempting to regain footing. The judge made a note. Sandra looked at me, brows raised, her pen pausing over her pad. My chest loosened only slightly, confusion rushing in where panic had been. Why would he correct them? Why defend me if he sat at their table? The hearing dragged on. Each motion, scribbled notes furiously, each objection, not because I needed them, but because the motion of the pen kept my hands from shaking. Across the aisle, my mother never looked at me. Her gaze stayed fixed on the bench, her posture perfect as though carved from marble. Michael leaned back casually, though his jaw tightened every time his attorney stumbled. When the judge finally called for adjournment, the scrape of chairs filled the air. I gathered my files slowly, deliberately buying time to breathe. Around me, the room emptied in a swell of footsteps and murmurs. Sandra leaned close, whispering, "You did well." They came harder than expected, but we held. I nodded, though the knot in my stomach remained. As I stepped into the hallway, the rush of people carried me forward. My eyes caught movement to my right. Charles approached his stride, steady, his briefcase tucked neatly in his hand. For a moment, I thought he might stop, acknowledge, but his eyes stayed even forward, a trace his familiarity. He passed so close, our shoulders nearly brushed. Then so quietly, I almost thought I imagined it. His voice slipped through the air. "Keep your receipts." I froze mid-step. The words were low, deliberate, meant only for me. My head turned, but he was already walking away, merging with the stream of attorneys, heading toward the elevators. He did not glance back. I stood still in the flow of bodies, my heart hammering. "Keep your receipts." The phrase repeated in my mind, each echo heavier than the last. Was it advice? A warning? A signal that he was not fully aligned with Michael and my mother? Or was it something else, a test to see if I was prepared to fight with the same sharpness my father once had? Sandra touched my elbow, drawing me from the fog. "You ready to go?" she asked softly. I nodded, forcing my legs to move, though they felt like lead. We walked together toward the doors. Outside, the late afternoon wind cut across the courthouse steps, sharp enough to make me shiver. I pulled my coat tighter, but the chill inside me had little to do with the weather. The city bustled around us, horns blaring, people hurrying past their lives untouched by the quiet war that had just begun inside. The phrase lingered with every breath. "Keep your receipts." It carried weight, both hope and suspicion, a tether I could not yet unravel. Was Charles Whitaker my enemy, bound to my brother and mother's cause? Or was he something else entirely, a hidden ally waiting for his moment? The uncertainty gnawed at me as I descended the courthouse steps, the echo of his voice threading itself into the cold Boston air. I walked toward Tremont Street with Sandra at my side, my briefcase heavy in my hand, the city alive around me, and the question burning silently in my chest, the one holding the key to my survival? Or was he the shadow preparing to strike when I least expected? Chapter 5, the headlines appeared the next morning before I had even finished my coffee. My phone buzzed with alerts, the notifications spilling across the screen like small detonations. A local paper had run a story with my picture alongside Michael's, the headline bold and damning. Carter siblings clash in bitter inheritance battle. Funds in question. My chest tightened as I scrolled through, reading the twisted summary of my life, reduced to paragraphs of speculation and innuendo. There was no mention of the truth, no mention of the projects the trust supported, no acknowledgement that I had been fulfilling my father's intentions. Only the implication that I was reckless, perhaps even dishonest. By mid-morning, the damage had spread. At the office, my assistant knocked gently on the door, her eyes hesitant. "Emily, there is something you need to know." She handed me a printed email. The law firm we had been negotiating with for weeks was pulling out of the contract. The reason was stated in careful clinical language. Due to reputational concerns associated with ongoing litigation, we cannot move forward with the partnership. I sat back in my chair, the paper limp in my hand. The contract had been one of our most significant opportunities of the year. I had worked late nights, drafted proposals, pitched in boardrooms, convinced myself it would stabilize the firm. Now it was gone, dissolved by a single headline. My assistant lingered in the doorway, as if waiting for me to speak. I could only nod, dismissing her gently, and stare at the ceiling until my vision blurred. My phone rang again. This time David Miller's name flashing across the screen. Once a colleague I trusted, he had left to build his own firm, but we had remained in touch collaborating when cases overlapped. I answered a flicker of hope in my voice. Instead, his tone was calling with stripped of warmth. Emily, given the circumstances, we cannot be associated with your practice at the moment. His words were careful, but the coldness cut deep. I opened my mouth to remind him of the years we had backed each other through difficult cases, but he cut me off. We simply cannot afford the risk. You understand. Then the line went dead. The silence after the call was deafening. I stared at the phone in my hand, the faint reflection of my face on the dark screen. Betrayal from family was one wound. Betrayal from those I had called colleagues was another, sharper, in a way I had not expected. By afternoon, my voicemail filled with messages from a number I recognized. Laura Kim, a reporter from the Boston Herald, had called 6 times. Her voice grew more insistent with each message. Ms. Carter, we'd like your comment. Ms. Carter, we need your side of the story. I deleted them one by one, unwilling to give her words any oxygen. That evening, her article appeared online anyway, complete with speculation about misuse of trust funds. Quotes from unnamed sources who claimed I was overwhelmed and unprepared. The photograph they used showed me walking out of the courthouse, eyes down, shoulders hunched. They had chosen the angle carefully. I closed my laptop with a snap, pressing my hands against my face. The city outside my window glowed with lights indifferent to my unraveling. Somewhere out there, students were still waiting for scholarship letters. Community leaders were still hoping for grants, and none of them knew why everything had stalled. I thought of calling them, explaining, but what would I say? That my own mother had signed her name to a complaint against me. That my brother was determined to bleed me dry. The next day, my neighbors walked out of my building, who had nodded politely in the elevator for years, now turned away. 2 women paused their conversation as I passed, their voices dropping though their eyes followed me. A man I had once helped with a property dispute avoided my gaze entirely, fumbling with his keys until I was gone. The air seemed thicker, each step heavier, as though judgment clung to me with every glance. I kept walking, chin lifted, though inside my chest ached. The betrayal in the courtroom had been expected. The betrayal in the headlines perhaps inevitable, but this was different. This was isolation in its purest form, the quiet rejection of a community I had called home. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same spot where the summons had first cut me open. The papers were stacked neatly beside me, my laptop glowing with lists of projects, stalled accounts, frozen articles piling in my inbox. My phone buzzed around my apartment with another call I did not answer. Lined with casebooks. The photographs of smiling students who had once received scholarships, thank you notes tacked to a corkboard. They stared back at me as if demanding answers I could not give. I pressed my palms flat to the table, willing myself to breathe. Outside voices carried faintly from the street below, laughter, footsteps, the ordinary rhythm of lives untouched by my turmoil. I wanted to step outside and be part of that rhythm, to be invisible again. Instead, I sat, rooted the silence of my apartment louder than any crowd. In that moment, the truth crystallized with brutal clarity. I was not only fighting Michael and my mother inside the courtroom, I was standing against a tide outside of it. A tide of suspicion, judgment, and distance. Clients, colleagues, neighbors, even strangers on the street. The world had tilted against me. I lifted my eyes to the window. For the first time, I let myself say the words aloud into the empty room. I am on my own. The sound was soft, barely above a whisper, but it rang truer than anything else I had spoken in weeks. Chapter 6. Memories came in waves, uninvited and relentless, filling the quiet of my apartment with echoes of a childhood I had spent years trying to bury. I saw myself at 8 years old, sitting at the long oak table in our Brookline house, my legs swinging beneath the chair because they did not yet touch the floor. Michael sat across from me, already tall for his age, already confident in ways I could never quite mimic. My father, Richard Carter, leaned back in his chair after dinner, sipping his coffee, while Michael explained the details of some mock business he had invented for a school project. My father's eyes gleamed with pride. "That's my boy. Sharp as a tack," he said, clapping Michael on the shoulder. When I chimed in about a story I had written for class, my father's smile softened, but his words came differently. "Emily, writing is nice, but it will not run a company. You're too tender-hearted for business." The words had stuck like thorns, not built for the tender-hearted that had defined his life. Too soft. Michael basked in the glow of praise while I shrank into myself, staring at the untouched vegetables on my plate, wishing I could vanish. Years later, those patterns never changed. At every holiday, every birthday, every small family gathering, Michael was the one whose victories were toasted. My mother mirrored my father's pride, always leaning toward her son, always placing her hand on his arm, as if to steady him on his climb. When she looked at me, her gaze carried affection, tinged with pity, as if I were a delicate glass better admired from a distance than relied upon. The memory shifted again, wrenching me to the night after my father's funeral. The house was thick with relatives and casseroles left behind by sympathetic neighbors. I remember standing in the dining room, the scent of wax and lilies, plates still clinging to my clothes from the service, low with grief. But my mother's voice cut through it all. Michael will carry the company forward. He has what it takes. She said it proudly, as if the decision were already made. Then her eyes slid toward me. Emily should focus on her law practice. A small office suits her. Not every child is meant to carry a legacy. The words stung sharper than any slap. I had swallowed hard, fighting back the heat rising in my throat. No one contradicted her. Uncles and cousins nodded. Michael smiled faintly, eyes lowered in false modesty. I slipped away from the table, carrying my plate untouched to the sink, the hum of conversation dimming behind me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had ever been truly seen by either of my parents. The apartment around me now was silent, but those voices rang louder than ever. I rose from my chair and walked to the cabinet where I kept the trust documents carefully organized. I spread them across the table, running my fingers over the clauses and figures, the board approvals, the grants already dispersed. Somewhere in the dense language, my father's intentions were written, and I searched for him there. I remembered one rare evening years before he died. He had come into the kitchen while I was working on a case file spread across the counter. He watched me for a long moment before speaking. "Responsibility is heavy, Emily." He said it almost absently, as if speaking to himself, but his eyes lingered on me longer than usual. At the time, I thought little of it. Now the words felt like a breadcrumb, a clue he had left behind. I gathered the pages together, my palms pressing against the cool paper. My father had chosen me for this, not Michael. Not because I was weak, but perhaps because I was strong in a way he had never acknowledged out loud. Profit. Strong enough to carry the burden of responsibility without crushing others beneath it. The doubts that had haunted me since childhood flared again. The sting of every dismissal, every comparison to Michael, every reminder that I was softer, smaller, less suited to power. But beneath the sting, something else pulsed steady and fierce. They had underestimated me for decades. They had stripped me of affection, of approval, of simple recognition, but they had not taken away my resolve. I stood and walked to the window. The lights of Boston shimmered against the Charles River, the city alive and indifferent to my turmoil. Somewhere out there, Michael was sharpening his arguments. My mother was convincing herself. She was protecting my father's legacy. And Charles Whitaker was sitting with secrets only he could unlock. They had all chosen their sides. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. My father's words about responsibility echoed in my mind. I pressed my hand flat against the cold pane, whispering to myself, "I will not let them take this from me." I turned back to the table, gathering the files into a neat stack. My fingers no longer trembled. The trust was more than money, more than influence. It was the one fragile thread of faith my father had left me, whether he had spoken it aloud or not. They could strip away contracts, reputation, even neighbors' respect, but they would not strip that from me. The decision crystallized in my chest, sharp and immovable. They would try to paint me as incapable. They would try to smother me under headlines and whispers. But I would fight. I would fight in the courtroom and the press, if I had to, in the silence of my own apartment when no one else believed in me. I stacked the papers, tied them with a ribbon I had kept from an old case file. My father's ghost lingered in the words he had written in the responsibility he had handed me. I whispered once more into the quiet, "You trusted me. I will prove you right." The night deepened outside, but inside a different kind of fire burned steady. I sat again at the table, my shoulders squared, my breath calm. Whatever they planned, whatever storm was waiting, I would not surrender the trust. I would not surrender the last piece of faith my father had given me. The second hearing arrived on a gray Friday morning, the kind of day when the sky seemed to press low against the city. I woke before dawn, my nerves already sparking, and dressed carefully, choosing the same navy suit I had worn for my first trial years ago. As I stood in front of the mirror, I studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me was tired shadows under her eyes, but she was steady. I gathered my files and walked out into the cold, the streets slick from overnight rain. By the time I reached the courthouse, the building hummed with activity. Attorneys clustered in the hallway, voices rising and falling like waves. I passed through security and found Sandra waiting near the courtroom door, her dark hair pulled back, her expression sharp with focus. She pressed a hand to my arm. "They will try something today," she murmured. "Be ready." When we stepped inside, I nodded, Michael was already seated at the plaintiff's table, his posture confident, his tie perfectly knotted. My mother sat beside him, her face composed, her eyes sliding past me as though I were invisible. Charles was there too, arranging documents with the same calm precision, his expression giving nothing away. The judge entered and the room rose. My knees felt stiff, but I forced myself up. Once we were seated again, Michael's counsel wasted no time. "Your Honor, new evidence has surfaced," he announced, holding up a folder with dramatic flair. "These emails demonstrate the defendant redirected funds from the Carter Foundation Trust into her personal accounts." The words landed like a stone in my gut. I glanced at Sandra, but she was already on her feet requesting copies. The attorney handed them over and she placed the papers between us. The emails looked legitimate at first glance. Addressed to me, showing transfers from the trust to my accounts with subject lines about urgent personal expenses. My stomach flipped. Sandra's jaw tightened. She stood, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "Your Honor, we object to the introduction of these emails without authentication. We request immediate forensic examination." The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "The request is reasonable. Can you produce an expert witness?" Sandra nodded and motioned toward the back of the room. A man in a crisp suit stepped forward, his laptop case in hand. "This is Daniel Reeves, certified forensic analyst with over 20 years of experience. He has reviewed preliminary metadata on these emails." "Permission granted," the judge said. "Proceed." Reeves opened his laptop at the witness stand, projecting the emails onto a screen for the courtroom. He spoke with calm authority, pointing to lines of code beneath the surface. "This message purports to come from Ms. Carter's account, but the server path shows alterations. The timestamps are inconsistent with actual sending times." He zoomed in on tiny anomalies in the data. "Here you can see where the body of the email was altered. Standard emails do not leave this kind of digital fingerprint unless they have been tampered with." The courtroom grew still. I watched Michael out of the corner of my eye. His jaw clenched, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. My mother remained rigid, her eyes fixed on the screen, lips pressed thin. Reeves continued, methodical and patient. "Each of these supposed transfers was fabricated. The bank accounts listed are valid, but the transactions never occurred. I have verified this directly with the banks involved. These emails are forgeries." Gasps rippled from the gallery. Sandra allowed a pause before she spoke again. "It is clear the plaintiff has submitted falsified evidence in an attempt to defame my client and mislead the court." Michael's attorney stammered, trying to object. "These documents were provided by an anonymous source," he claimed. "We had no reason to suspect alteration." The judge's face darkened. "Mr. Carter, your side is responsible for the evidence you submit. The introduction of falsified documents is a serious matter." Michael leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney, his composure cracking for the first time. He looked toward me. Then his eyes, sharp, filled with fury, masked as indignation. Sandra placed her hand on mine beneath the table, steady and firm. We held our silence as the judge turned his gaze back to the plaintiffs. "If this court sees another piece of evidence that has been doctored, I will consider sanctions against the submitting party. Do I make myself clear?" Michael's attorney rang through the courtroom like a gavel itself. I exhaled slowly, the knot in my chest loosening. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faint surge of power shifting, however slightly, back toward me. The truth had found a voice, and it carried weight. When the judge adjourned, the room erupted in whispers. I gathered my papers carefully, my hands steadier than they had been in days. Sandra leaned close, her voice low but fierce. That was their big swing, and it just collapsed in their hands. I nodded, my gaze drifting across the aisle. Michael avoided my eyes, his lips pressed thin, his posture rigid. My mother smoothed the hem of her jacket, her composure unbroken, but her hand trembled faintly against the fabric. As we stepped into the hallway, the sound of murmurs followed us. Fragments of conversations carried on the air. Fabricated, forgeries, sanctions. The words clung to the walls like smoke. You see, Sandra walked beside me. They are not untouchable. You can win this. I let her words settle into me, a spark of resolve, kindling again. Outside, the cold March wind cut across my face, but I welcomed it. It reminded me I was alive, still standing, still fighting. The courthouse doors closed behind us, and the city noise rushed in, horns blaring, footsteps quick against the pavement. I drew in a long breath and released it, my pulse steadying with each step. For the first time since the lawsuit began, hope did not feel like a distant memory. It felt like something solid beneath my feet, fragile but real, carrying me forward into whatever came next. The next hearing carried a weight that pressed against my ribs from the moment I woke. The sky above Boston was bright for once, sunlight glinting across the Charles River as I crossed the bridge toward the courthouse. But my chest felt heavy with the knowledge that something was coming. Sandra walked beside me, flipping through her notes, her focus razor sharp. She glanced at me once, as if to gauge whether I was steady enough to face whatever surprise Michael had planned. I gave her a small nod, though inside I felt the familiar storm rising. The courtroom was fuller than usual. Reporters lingered in the back, their pens, ready eyes hungry. I kept mine forward as I slid into my chair, smoothing the skirt of my suit, aligning the files before me. Across the aisle, Michael looked too calm, too composed, his smile thin but deliberate. My mother sat beside him, her hand resting on her purse, her pearls catching the light with Charles silent, unreadable, arranging his papers with the precision of ritual. When the judge entered the room, the tension thickened. After the preliminaries, Charles rose slowly, the scrape of his chair echoing in the stillness. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Your Honor, pursuant to instructions left by my late client, Richard Carter, I request permission to submit a sealed letter for in-camera review. The words rippled through the room. My head jerked slightly toward him, my pulse racing. A sealed letter. From my father. Michael's attorney sprang to his feet almost immediately, his tone sharp. Objection. Such a document cannot be relevant to this proceeding. If there were instructions, they were meant for the family collectively, not for the defendant alone. My mother leaned in close to Michael, whispering furiously. His jaw tightened as he whispered back, his face flushed with sudden heat. His voice remained calm, measured. Charles did not flinch. That is not correct. This letter was prepared specifically for release only under these circumstances. If the trustee, my client's daughter, was ever challenged in a court of law, I was instructed to provide it. The judge frowned, his gaze sweeping the room. Very well, he said after a long pause. I will review the letter. Bailiff, bring it here. Charles reached into his briefcase and drew out a leather envelope, worn but intact. The wax seal cracked, but still clinging faintly to the flap. My breath caught as he handed it over. The judge examined it carefully, then opened it, his eyes moving steadily across the page. The silence in the room deepened, the kind that seemed to press into the walls and steal the air. Finally, the judge looked up, his expression unreadable. Mr. Whitaker, you may read the relevant portion into the record. Charles adjusted his glasses clearly and unfolded the letter, etched into the air. To my attorney of record, Charles Whitaker, if my daughter Emily Grace Carter is ever challenged as trustee of the Carter Foundation, trust, you are to present this letter as Exhibit A. She is to be regarded not merely as trustee, but as my star client. She has my full confidence both in judgment and integrity. She has been prepared for this role in ways her challengers cannot see. The words pierced through me like sunlight breaking into a locked room. My throat closed, my vision blurred. I heard the shuffle of papers, the faint intake of breath from the gallery, but all I could focus on were those three words. Star client. Charles continued reading passages that painted a portrait of me I had never realized my father carried. Notes about our breakfast conversations years ago. The way I dissected problems, the way I refused to take shortcuts. Even my mistakes were mentioned. He had noticed things I thought invisible, framed not as failures, but as lessons learned. Across the aisle, Michael's face tightened. His jaw set so hard the muscle flickered beneath his skin. My mother's hands curled slightly against her lap, her eyes fixed downward, refusing to meet mine. When Charles finished, he folded the letter with the same care he had opened it and placed it on the table. The judge cleared his throat, his voice firm. This letter makes clear the intent of the settler of the trust. It is strong evidence of his wishes, and therefore will be considered by this court as an important factor in evaluating the trustee's authority. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Reporters scribbled furiously, the sound of pens scratching like rainfall. Sandra squeezed my hand under the table, her grip grounding me. Tears
For years,
down my
I had
cheeks
carried the
before
weight
I
of
could stop
believing
them. My father never truly saw me, never trusted me with more than polite distance. And here, in the middle of a courtroom, where my family tried to dismantle me, his words reached across time to stand by my side. I pressed a hand against my mouth, forcing my sobs silent, but my shoulders trembled. For the first time, I felt the truth settle inside me. My father had chosen me, not out of obligation or pity, but out of faith. The judge's gavel came down lightly, dismissing the session until the following week. The sound echoed through the courtroom, but I barely heard it. I sat still, hands pressed against the letter now resting on our table, my tears falling quietly, the storm inside me breaking into something fierce and undeniable. In that moment, surrounded by whispers and stares,
I felt my father's hand steady on my shoulder,
unseen, but certain, and the conviction that I would carry his trust forward no matter what came next. Chapter 9, the judge's ruling, came a week later, in a courtroom so silent I could hear the scratch of his pen before he spoke. After careful review of the evidence, the motion to remove Emily Carter as trustee of the Carter Foundation Trust is denied. Costs of this action will be borne by the plaintiffs. His gavel struck once, and the sound echoed through me like thunder breaking a storm. I sat frozen for a moment, hardly breathing. Then the words began to sink in, heavy and freeing all at once. Denied. Plaintiffs pay. I turned slightly enough to see Michael's jaw clench, his lips drawn into a hard line. My mother sat beside him, shoulders stiff, her face pale beneath the careful strokes of makeup. Sandra's hand pressed against mine under the table, her smile small but fierce. "You won," she whispered. For the first time in months, the word felt real. Won. Outside the courthouse, the world had already shifted. Reporters swarmed the steps. Microphones
walking
thrust
Sandra,
forward, guiding me through the flying, but their words trailed behind like smoke. A victory for women trustees, a triumph against family betrayal. Headlines printed the next morning captured it in bolder terms. Emily Carter defeats family in inheritance battle, a woman who stood alone and prevailed. The tide of public opinion turned almost overnight. Articles that once painted me reckless now called me resilient. Profiles highlighted the projects the trust had supported, the students who had received scholarships, the community center rising brick by brick. For the first time, strangers stopped me on the street, not to whisper, but to offer a quiet nod or a word of congratulations. Michael, meanwhile, faced storms of his own. Within weeks, Carter Hardware Supply was in crisis. News spread quickly that several investors had withdrawn their support, shaken by his failed lawsuit and the questions it raised. Shares
I read
in the
in the
privately
business
held
journal
company
that an emergency
board
value
meeting had been called. But no resolution could steady a ship that was already taking on water. Rumors swirled about shouting matches in Michael's office, about employees leaving in waves. Each article painted a picture of a man losing control piece by piece, the empire he had claimed crumbling beneath him. My mother fared no better in her own circle. The society pages that once praised her for charity work now hinted at disgrace. At a gala she attended alone, the whispers followed her like shadows. Women she had once called friends now turned cold, murmuring that a mother suing her daughter over her husband's legacy had crossed a line too far. She retreated from the spotlight, slipping out of events early, her name no longer paired with admiration, but with reproach. One afternoon, David Miller appeared in my office, unannounced, his suit immaculate. He spoke as though
His
nothing had
expression
happened,
carefully rehearsed.
congratulating me on the ruling, praising my composure under fire. Then he shifted voice smooth, suggesting perhaps we could revisit the partnership his firm had abandoned. "There is goodwill in the air now, Emily," he said lightly. "We would be proud to stand beside you." I let him finish before I answered. "No, David. When I needed allies, you turned away. I will not forget that." His smile faltered, the color rising in his cheeks. He muttered something about timing, about circumstances, then left without shaking my hand. I sat for a long time after staring at the door. He had closed, a strange mix of sorrow and satisfaction swirling in my chest. Later that week, I opened the folder of pending scholarships and found the application of a young woman named Chloe Grant. She was 19 from Quincy and wanted to study biomedical engineering, working at a diner to save money of sketching designs for medical devices on napkins during breaks. She wrote about wanting to build something that could save lives, about being told she aimed too high. I read her words twice, my throat tightening. I saw myself in her determination, in the stubborn fire beneath her sentences. I remembered my own nights hunched over law books, the voice of my father echoing that I was too tender-hearted for business. Chloe's dream was different, but the battle was the same. To be seen, to be trusted. I signed the approval that afternoon, the pen steady in my hand. The grant would cover her tuition and give her space to breathe, to chase what she saw beyond the horizon. As I closed the file, a warmth spread through me, quiet but certain. The city outside my window glowed with spring light. The snow had melted, leaving the sidewalks wet. I stood at the glass, watching the river's promise. And for the first time in years, the weight on my chest eased. I thought of Michael's smirk fading in the courtroom, of my mother's bowed head, of the letter Charles had read that had carried my father's voice back into my life. I thought of Chloe's words, of the future she was fighting for. And then I realized something I had not allowed myself to feel until that moment. I was free. The battles had scarred me, but they had also carved me into something stronger. The trust remained in my hands, not as a burden, but as a torch. I smiled softly to myself, a small, steady smile that felt like the first true breath after being underwater too long. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt not just the weight of responsibility, but the lightness of freedom. The weeks after the ruling passed in a blur of rebuilding. The courthouse no longer loomed over me like a shadow. Instead, it became part of the city skyline again. Just another building, not the battleground where I had nearly lost everything. I poured myself back into the work of the Carter Foundation Trust with a hunger I had not felt in years. I wanted every stalled project moving again, every scholarship letter sent, every community leader reassured that the promises we made would be honored. Each morning, I arrived at my office early, the air still cool from the night my desk stacked with files waiting for signatures. Sandra often joined me with coffee in hand, her presence a steady reminder that I had not carried this fight alone. Together we called partners, renegotiated contracts, and reopened conversations that had been silenced by scandal. Some voices were cautious, but most carried relief, as if the storm had finally broken. It was in the middle of this momentum that Charles Whitaker arrived unannounced. My receptionist knocked gently on the door and whispered that he was waiting outside. I told her to send him in my pulse, quickening at the thought of what new weight he might bring. He entered with his usual composure, his leather briefcase in hand, his silver hair catching the afternoon light. Without preamble, he set a small bundle of papers on my desk, tied with a faded ribbon. "Your father entrusted these to me," he said quietly. "Letters he wrote, but never mailed. He asked that I deliver them only if you proved yourself capable of carrying the trust as he intended. I believe that moment has come." I stared at the bundle, the edges of the envelopes worn. The ribbon creased from years of waiting. My throat tightened as I managed to thank him. He inclined his head, offered no further explanation, and left as silently as he had arrived. They rested on my desk I did not touch the letters, a presence I was not yet ready to face. Days passed before I found the courage. Late one evening, when the city outside had quieted and the glow of street lamps shimmered across the river, I untied the ribbon. The first envelope slid open with a faint sigh, the paper inside smooth but fragile. His handwriting was unmistakable, neat and deliberate. "Emily, if you are reading this, it means you are still fighting. Good. Do not stop. Responsibility is not measured by ease, but by endurance. You will doubt yourself, and others will doubt you more. But I saw what you carried, even when you thought I did not. That is why I left this to you. That is why you are my star client." Tears blurred the words. I pressed the page against my chest, the ink warming under my hand, as though his voice had traveled through time, wondering whether he had noticed me, whether I had ever been more than an afterthought bent beneath the certainty of that letter. He had seen me. He had trusted me. I read 2 more letters that night, each one filled with fragments of his thoughts, moments I had long forgotten, but he had carried. He wrote about watching me prepare cases late into the night, about the stubbornness in my arguments, about the way I defended clients who could not defend themselves. He admitted he had not known how to say these things aloud, but he had known I would need them one day. He had left them as armor. When I finally set the bundle down, exhaustion washed over me, but it was the kind that comes after release, not defeat. I slept deeply for the first time in months. The next morning, I carried one of the letters with me to the harbor. The wind was sharp, cutting across the water, but I unfolded the page as I read it at the railing. My father's words steady, even as the paper fluttered in the breeze. If you are reading this, it means you are still fighting. Good. Do not stop. I looked out across the harbor, the skyline stretching behind me, and let the words settle inside. The battles with Michael and my mother had ended, but new ones would always come. Responsibility never ceased. It only shifted. And now I was ready. In the weeks that followed, I finalized the program that had taken shape in my mind during the darkest hours of the lawsuit. A legal support initiative for young trustees and nonprofit leaders facing resistance, designed to give them access to counsel, to mentorship, to resources I had nearly lost. We named it the Star Client Program, not as a tribute to me, but as a tribute to the belief that even those dismissed as unworthy could rise when given the chance. Applications poured in faster than I expected. Young women managing family foundations. First-generation leaders struggling to navigate boards who doubted them. Each story reminded me of my own. Each one carrying the same thread of determination, tangled in fear. Reading them strengthened my resolve. Chloe Grant was among the first to benefit. I called her personally to tell her the scholarship had been approved. Her voice broke with disbelief, and I smiled through my own tears as she whispered, "Thank you," over and over. When I hung up, I looked at her file once more. 19, ambitious, dreaming of biomedical engineering. I saw myself reflected in her stubborn hope. At night, when the office emptied, I often returned to the letters. I did not read them all at once. Some I left tied, waiting for days when courage ran thin. Others I carried with me to court or to meetings, silent companions reminding me that doubt was not the end. I walked again to the beginning of endurance. The air cold enough to sting my cheeks, the city alive behind me. I stood with the bundle in my coat pocket, the wind whipping across the water, and for the first time, the scars of the past months did not ache. They steadied me. The trust was safe. The projects were thriving. The new program was growing beyond anything I had envisioned. And I, the daughter once told she was too tender-hearted for business, was building a legacy, rooted not in profit, but in faith. I whispered into the night more to myself than to anyone else. "You trusted me, Dad. I will not stop." The harbor lights flickered, the water shifting silver in the dark. I turned back toward the city, my steps steady, my heart light. For the first time, I was not carrying my father's faith as a burden. If you have ever faced betrayal inside your family, if you have carried the sting of being doubted and still found the strength to stand, then you know what it means to fight for your place. Share your story with me. And if you want to hear more stories of justice, of karma, of those who rose even when everything fell against them, stay with me and subscribe so you will not miss what comes next.